Okay guys, so to get started, I want to talk a bit about animation in the UX context specifically because that's what's most relevant to us. Okay, so in UX, animation is mostly used to support usability. Of course, you can use it to create a more delightful experience and have it just be like a visual aid, but you can also use it strategically to support usability and to create a easier, more straightforward and delightful experience for the users. Usually, we use it to provide feedback and status information and enhance the sense of manipulation. That means reinforcing the feedback that allows the user to understand they have successfully interacted with a bit of your digital product. The most common use of animation inside UX is micro-interactions. You probably heard this term a lot, and I want to introduce this term with the definition that the Nielsen-Norman Group gives to it. If you don't know them, they are a research-based UX company. They have some really great resources and articles if you want to give that a look. And to me, they are a very trustworthy source of information whenever you have any kind of UX or UI question. So make sure to give them a look. So according to them, microinteractions are trigger feedback pairs in which the trigger can be a user action or an alteration in the system state. The feedback is a narrowly targeted response to the trigger and is communicated through small, highly contextual, usually visual changes in the user interface. So in simpler words, microinteractions are just a pair of a trigger and a feedback. The trigger can be activated by the user or the system itself, and the feedback is simply a stimulus the user gets to understand that the interaction was successful, and it's usually of a visual nature. Keep in mind that the quality and polish of microinteractions and animations inside a product can separate a delightful product from a tolerable one. And finally, keep in mind that animation usually has a skeuomorphic behavior. This means that it looks to emulate the real world or seem familiar to behaviors that the user has observed in the real world. This doesn't mean you have to make your animations hyper-realistic, but whenever you're stuck thinking how to animate something, draw inspiration from the real world, because that's what the user is familiar with and it will look similar to the mental models the user already has. Some of the most common micro-interactions are things like scroll bars, buttons, state changes, so for example when you click it and it changes colors, the pull to refresh gesture on mobile, swiping gestures, notifications, toggle switches. Okay, so in its most basic form, the structure of a micro-interaction consists of three parts. The first one being a trigger, which is the action that initiates the micro-interaction, and it can be both user-triggered or product-triggered. Then the rules, which determine the specific parameters of how that micro-interaction responds to the trigger. And finally, the feedback, which informs the user what's happening in that interaction. Okay, so let's get to it. The first thing we're gonna check out is the animation presets you already have available in Figma. Okay, so the first two things you're gonna do is first creating a frame, because to animate we will most of the time be switching from one frame to another. The second thing you gotta keep in mind is that naming your layers appropriately is very important in animation, because when you animate and you switch from one frame to another, the name of the layers is what tells Figma that an object in one frame is the same object in the next frame, even though you change its shape, its color, or your position. Through naming, you're gonna tell Figma that that's the same object and it should be animating from one state to another. So you're gonna see, for example, if I create this ellipse, you can see Figma automatically names it as ellipse 1, but then if I duplicate that, check what happens. It names it as ellipse 2. So for example, if I have these two frames and then I want to use this component and animate that from left to right, this won't work because for Figma this is not the same object. So to get Figma to understand this is the same object but you want it moving from left to right, I usually use a very simple trick, which is making it a component, renaming that component as ellipse green, and then creating instances of this component, because that will ensure that my elements always have the same name, thus indicating Figma this is the same component across different screens. If you check the naming here is ellipse green, If I check it in here, it's ellipse screen, so we're good to go. Okay, so the next step will be clicking on the prototype tab, clicking on the frame. Then when you're on prototyping mode, you will notice when you hover over elements, these dots will appear, which will allow you to drag and drop into the frame you want your previous frame to animate to. Okay, so once you link two frames, you're gonna get this animation menu. In the first dropdown, you will set the trigger. In this case, it's set to on click, but you can pick dragging, hovering, pressing a certain key from your keyboard, mouse enter, mouse leave. You can pick any trigger you want. Let's leave it as on click for now. Then you're gonna set the feedback and the rules of it. So after the trigger is activated, so basically after the user clicks, what's it gonna do? So you can pick going back, navigating to, setting variable and conditionals. By the way, you can find an advanced prototyping tutorial on my channel. I'm gonna link it on the description, so you can learn how to prototype using variables, which is a very powerful feature Figma recently introduced, so make sure to check that. You can also make the frame scroll to a certain point, open a link, or open an overlay. With open an overlay, you can prototype basically pop-ups and side menus and that sort of elements. We're gonna see that on an example later. But for now, let's stick to navigate to, which basically changes from one frame to another. Then it will allow you to pick which frame it will navigate to. I already said that by dragging it to the frame 24. Then you can specify how it will animate. So you can pick presets like instant. Let's give that a look. By the way, you can specify the starting point of your prototype by selecting the frame, making sure you're on the prototype tab and clicking on the plus icon on the flow starting point, which is add starting point, and you're gonna get this starting point indicator, which you can click and a prototype pop-up window will come up. So remember, this is set to instant and the trigger is click. So when I click it, it simply goes to the next frame without any type of animation. To edit the animation, you can click on the small arrow. Let's check how dissolve looks. To reset it, you can press the R key and click again to check it out. So dissolve basically blends one frame into the other one, and the one you will probably use the most is Smart Animate. So what Smart Animate does is it lets Figma kind of guess what the in-between frames of the two frames you specified. So in this case, we have one frame where the circle is to the left, and then one frame in which the circle is to the right. So Figma basically completes the animation in between, which will be all the in-between frames of the circle going from left to right, and it will animate it in a very smooth and seamless way. Each one of those animating modes can be further customized. You can specify things like having a bouncy animation, and you can check a preview of it in here. So click R to reset it. Can be quick, and you can change the speed of it. Let's try 300. Press R to reset. Let's try with 1000 milliseconds, which is a second. Make it gentle. You can even go as far as customizing the curve of the animation, so it suits your needs exactly as you want it. If you want a simple, smooth animation, I usually use Smart Animate, make it ease in and out, and maybe 300 milliseconds. That's like kind of the default settings. They work pretty good. Okay guys, now let's animate some micro interactions. Let's start with the hamburger menu icon. Okay, to get started, let's create a frame. Inside that frame, I'm gonna create this bar element, and I'm gonna duplicate it. You can duplicate it by dragging and holding Shift and Option, and then tapping Ctrl D to duplicate your selection. And with that, I've created a very simple hamburger menu. Okay, let's now turn this into components. Let's name this bar 1, bar 2, and bar 3. Okay, let me move my actual components in here, and I'm gonna just create instances of them. Remember, you can duplicate by dragging and holding Shift and Option. So you can see I've created instances of my components named bar 1, 2, and 3. Change the color to a darker one. The next thing I'm gonna do is dragging that frame, holding Shift just to make it a straight line, and Option or Alt for Windows, and that will let me duplicate it. And you're gonna see why the naming is important in this part. So you're gonna see I kept my consistent naming. So even though I duplicated that frame, this is still named bar 1, bar 2, and bar 3. What we're gonna do now is delete bar 3, and we're gonna create an X out of these 2 remaining bars, because I want that hamburger menu to animate into an X when it's activated, and then when the X is clicked, it will animate into the hamburger menu again. Let's create this X. The next thing I'm gonna do is selecting the 3 bars and tapping Ctrl G, which will group them for me. And I'm gonna do the same thing with the X. Tap Ctrl G, that will group it for me. Next, I will go to the prototype tab. I'm gonna select this group because I want the trigger to be clicking on this specific group. And you're gonna see if I hover over it, I'm gonna see the animating dots to the sides. I'm gonna click on this and drag and drop it into the next frame. I'm gonna leave the settings as Smart Animate is in and out and 300 milliseconds, and I'm gonna do the same thing for the X. I'm gonna click it, search for the animating dots. You can grab any of the dots and just simply drop it in the frame you want to be animated. I'll leave the same settings. Smart Animate is in and out, 300 milliseconds. And let's check how that looks. We got our hamburger menu, and when I click it, okay guys, so I just tried this out and it didn't work, and I went back to check what was wrong. And as I told you, naming is very important. You gotta have a consistent naming in everything. So my mistake was I had these first bars grouped as, it was named as group 1, and then this one was named as group 2 because Figma automatically named them for me. So what I did is just changing the one that was named group 2 to group 1, and then let's check that out. When you open it, we got our hamburger menu, and when you click it, you're gonna see a very smooth animation in between the bars, where the 3rd bar just disappears and the other 2 bars rotate 45 degrees to create the X, and it will work the same way backwards when you click the X. Let's now animate a progress bar. This one is gonna be pretty simple. Let's create a button real quick. Let's create a gray rectangle with that brown edges. Next, I'm gonna copy this gray bar, paste it on top of it, and let's make this green. Okay, so we have our basic building blocks. By the way, the tip of converting things to components is just to ensure the consistent naming, so Figma makes it automatic for you. But you also can do that without creating components. It's just like a best practice, you know. But I'm gonna create this without using components just to show you. So you gotta make sure you keep the naming consistent. So let's name this green bar, gray bar, and the bottom doesn't really matter because I'm not gonna animate that, but let's name it button. So I'm gonna create 3 different steps for this, or 3 different frames. Let me duplicate those. Remember, that's done by dragging and holding Alt or Option. So on my first step, what I'm gonna do is make this far very small and then change its opacity to 0 because I don't want it to be visible. Then I wanna make this 50%, so let's check the width of this. It's 250, let's make this 125, that's 50%. And the final one, I wanna make it 100%. So remember to make sure your naming is consistent. Remember, you can check that in your layers panel. You can see green bar is named green bar in all of the frames, and the same with all of the components. So we can go ahead and start animating. So let's click on the prototype tab. Let's go to my first frame and let's insert a new flow starting point. And let's make the button the trigger of my animation. So let's select that button, drag the animating dot into the next frame. The trigger will be on click. The animation will be set to Smart Animate, 300 milliseconds. And we're gonna do the same for this next button. Drag it to the next one, leave the frames as it is, and let's play that. So if I click on the next button, you're gonna see the bar smoothly animate across. Let's now create a simple loading icon. Let's start by creating a frame. You can create loading icon animations in a lot of different ways. I'm gonna show you a very simple one that works really good. So let's start by creating our component. So what you're gonna do is find this arc handle, move it so these other two handles appear. Then you're gonna find the ratio one and drag it outwards to create sort of a ring shape. And then what I do is simply closing this again. Once you have your ring shape, you're gonna go to gradient, change it from linear to angular, customize it to the appearance you would like. I'm gonna change it to my darker gray, and then I'm gonna make it a bit more transparent in this side, and you will have this basic shape. Okay, so you can turn this into a component. Let's name this loading icon. Okay guys, now that we have our component created, let's drag and create a copy of that. A very important step when you're animating rotation in Figma is to create a frame around the element that is rotating, because that will be the point of reference for Figma to know what element is rotating. So if you keep the frame consistent when the inside element is rotating, Figma is going to know it's supposed to animate rotation. Let me show you. So let's tap in Shift A to create an auto layout frame. Let's change this to fixed and fixed. Now that I have my first frame, I'm gonna drag that by holding Alt or Option to create my second frame, and I'm gonna go to my component and I'm gonna hold Shift and rotate it from one of the corners. I'm holding Shift so it rotates in regular intervals, and I'm gonna leave that as 45 degrees. Let that go. Make sure your component is named the same, so loading icon and loading icon. And then let's go to the prototype tab. Let's pick this frame and create a new flow starting point. Then I'm gonna drag the animation handle into this one, and we're gonna use a new setting because in this case, because as it is a loading icon, we don't need the user to click it so it activates. So we're gonna use a different trigger named after delay, which basically waits for a defined period of time to trigger the animation. We're gonna click on that and change it from 800 milliseconds to 1 millisecond. This is basically means it's instant. So after 1 millisecond, it would navigate, basically go to the next frame, which is this one. And I will leave these settings as Smart Animate, and we're gonna change this from gentle or the other ones that we used earlier to linear, because I want this to be a linear rotation. I don't want any changes in the acceleration of it. So let's click on linear and let's preview that first part of the animation. Click on the preview button. It seems to work good. So let's create the rest of the frames. I'm gonna drag this again. I'm gonna rotate this 45 degrees. I'm gonna connect this to the next frame, change it from on click to after delay, leave this in linear, and the rest seems to be okay. Let's create our next frame. Rotate this 45 degrees again, connect this, change to after delay of 1 second, change this to linear, and finally let's connect the last screen to the first one. Once again, after delay of 1 second, linear, and that seems to be fine. So let's preview our animation, and it works perfectly. If I move this to the side, you can see how it cycles in between all the frames that I defined. And finally, I'm gonna show you the overlay animation. So for that, you will essentially need 2 frames. As an example, I'm gonna create a tooltip. Okay, so what I want to do is to have a tooltip appear whenever the user hovers over this information icon. So let's create that tooltip bubble. Okay, so something very important to keep in mind is whatever element you need to overlay on top of your design needs to be inside a frame. So in this case, mine is. So let's go ahead and animate this. Let's go to my prototype tab. You're gonna, if you want the overlay to appear when the user hovers over any part of this, you can do so, but I just want it to appear when they hover over the icon. So I'm gonna create that. I'm gonna drag that to my next frame, which is frame 37, and switch from navigate to open overlay. And some new settings are gonna appear. You can either make it appear in the center, to the side, in the bottom. I'm gonna pick manual, and it's gonna show a preview of how it's gonna look, so I can manually fix it in the place I want it. This is just kind of a preview, so don't worry about it. You can then click away. Now let's preview this animation. We don't want it to be on click, we want it to be while hovering, so let's close it. So let's close that and fix it. I'm gonna click on the connection, I'm gonna click on the arrow to edit it, and yeah, indeed we had it set to on click. Let's change that to while hovering, and let's preview that again. And you see, whenever I hover over the information icon, my tooltip will appear. And that's it for today's video, guys. Remember, try to use animation in a way that it enhances the experience for the user and makes it an easier or more delightful one. I really encourage you to play around with this and try to create the most seamless and polished animations you can. And always keep your users in mind. How can you make their experience better, faster, more intuitive through animation? And that's it for today, guys. You've been giving me some pretty cool ideas for future content, so please keep doing that. I've been trying to create the videos you've requested. Remember to leave a like if you got any value out of this, and subscribe if you want to keep up with the channel. And that's it for today.